This happened about 5 or 6 years ago. I believe I was around 18 at the time. For starters, I lived in a city where neighborhoods and forests kind of blend together. There are plenty of wooded areas where people go to have bonfires and parties and that sorts of thing. One night, after discovering that all of our usual spots were already crowded with people, I suggested we go to a spot I had been to a few times nearby. I had in fact been there several times, but only ever during the day. The street where we parked was about 200 feet away from the tree line. It was your average middle-class neighborhood. Nothing crazy was really known to happen there. So we walk over, start a bonfire, and we're all having a really good time. Some of us are drinking and smoking a bit, myself included. About 45 minutes passed by, and I was now a little bit intoxicated. Not anything major though. Over the sound of our quiet music and my friends talking, I began to make out an odd sound. I couldn't quite tell what it was at first, so I wrote it off as just hearing things initially. After maybe another 10 minutes went by though, I began to hear it again, a little bit louder this time. It still sounded relatively far away, but it sounded almost like Velcro tearing or something. I stopped and just kind of sat there, trying to listen to what was going on, while my friends were oblivious and carried away laughing and talking. They hadn't seemed to have noticed yet. That's when I heard it clearer, a sound I was very familiar with. A zapping noise, like the kind you'd hear from a taser. It was very brief but unmistakable. My stomach dropped, and I began to look around a little frantically. My girlfriend at the time was the first to notice my distress. She asked me what was wrong, and I explained what just happened. She immediately started worrying as well. She got my friends to quiet down as best she could, and we all sat there in silence, listening out for any noise. Then we all heard it, an electric zap, brief again, but we all recognized the sound. We started panicking a bit. We quickly put out the fire while asking each other what the fuck that was, or where it was coming from. We were all too scared to walk out. It was only a 5-minute walk to the street, but it was through pitch black darkness. With all of us collectively, we mustered up the courage to finally walk the path out, and we didn't run into anyone on our way there. We finally got to the street and began to walk towards our cars, nervously laughing and relishing in being under the street lamps once again. That was when we saw him. I saw him first, a man walking in the darkness towards us, not at us, just kind of walking in the direction we'd just come from, slightly to the right of us. He appeared to be holding some sort of stick of some sort. The man's appearance obviously scared me at first, but after a brief second I calmed myself down. It was a pretty safe neighborhood that I knew really well, and it was common to see people out walking at night. Then though, I noticed he was staring right at us. His stare burned itself into my mind. We passed each other by. My friends and I were all silent, as we were having a stare down with this random man. Not even breaking eye contact, as soon as we passed him by, he held up the pole in his hands and smiled this huge creepy smile. His eyes opened so wide they almost bulged out of his head. The end of the stick lit up a bright light, and that same zapping sound happened once again, much louder this time. The man was holding a cattle prod. We live in a city with no farmland nearby. There was no reason to have a thing like that on him. My friends and I were silently shitting ourselves as he began to follow behind us about 20 feet away. When we got to our cars, he ran into the woods without a flashlight or anything. We all hopped in and peeled the fuck out of there. We never went back to that spot again. Now this is something I really want to talk about to be sure that everyone is cautious and stays level-headed at all times. For some context, I live in the middle of nowhere in Canada, an old town that had quite a few abandoned buildings due to an absence of residents. Me and my many friends were tired of the lack of entertainment options for us, so what we decided to do was explore these abandoned buildings. Prior to the experience I'm about to talk about, nothing had ever happened that was crazy to us. Occasionally, we'd see a small bit of blood-like liquid or other bodily fluids, or see a pentagram spray painted on the ground from someone who went to a house previously, but nothing too crazy. Until the last time I went to explore. When I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part mental hospital. Weird combination, I know. It closed down due to a lack of patients and a lack of children at the daycare. Big surprise, I guess. I decided to go back there with my friends to explore. For context, I was 15 when this happened, and most of my friends were the same age. When we got there, it was rather cliché. There was fog, and it was rather dark. There was also a light drizzle of rain. We went to the main gate, which had been padlocked shut. We decided to help each other hop over it, and made a ton of noise in the process. We were all laughing and giggling the whole time, unsuspecting of what was to come. We looked around at the small play place and park with flashlights we had on our person. Even with our somewhat powerful lights, the visibility was rather limited. We decided to actually enter the building itself. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section of the complex. There were still old Legos and wood chips from previous furniture, old torn dolls and toys strewn about. The further we walked around the daycare section, we naturally became more and more silent, until all we could hear was the crunch of the dirt under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room. I walked over to observe them, when all of a sudden, we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door leading to the psych ward part of the building. My friends and I nervously glanced at each other. As a whole, we were a group of 5. Most of us were very bold and cocky. As we shared our glances, my friend Brian suggested we go and check to see what the sound had come from. Personally, I was not too fond of the idea, but with my group of friends, there was no way anyone was going to decline such a thing. We all stacked up against the door and opened it slowly. It was rusted to the floor, and we had to heave hard to get it to open. As we walked in, the metallic smell and must became stronger, with a hint of something else which I couldn't quite put my finger on at the moment. We walked in, our flashlights pointed in every direction, with Brian leading the group. The hallways were tight. To the left and right were the occasional metal doorway, some with the doors wide open. I felt slightly claustrophobic, and it felt a little bit hard to breathe. As we continued, Brian shone his flashlight into a room and recoiled. We all stopped walking as Brian slowly entered the room. "What's wrong?" I asked him. "Oh, I thought I saw someone here, but it seems it's all fine now." To be honest, I thought he was just messing with us to increase our anxiety, but looking back, I think he was completely honest. He backed out of the room to join us again, and we continued walking deeper into the psych ward. That is, until another friend suddenly told us to stop. We came to a halt and began to listen. In the distance ahead of us in the darkness, we could hear the subtle pitter-patter of footsteps echoing down the hallway. We each looked at each other, fear in our eyes. Brian continued walking toward the sounds. We considered turning back for a moment without him, wondering if some ghost or something was in the building. But of course, we wouldn't do that to him. The closer we got to the sounds, the more I felt like I was being watched. When we finally entered a room on the right, there was a smell of rotting meat. In front of us was a dead deer. Its innards were spilled all over the floor, staining the concrete. A friend of mine had a very weak stomach and vomited all over the floor. At that moment, we began to hear whispering. Brian shone his flashlight to the corner of the room, where a man with short hair was standing with his head facing down. He wore a bright green t-shirt, stained with what I assume was blood. He didn't have any socks on, and his feet appeared quite badly damaged. He was twitching sporadically and continued to mumble even after we saw him. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he made his first true movement. The man looked up at us with vacant eyes and a haunting grin that sent shivers down my spine. "Are you guys here for the feast?" He said each word with a varying inflection and energy. This kicked us over the edge, and we bolted out of the room all the way back to the daycare center. The door was still open. We decided to try and slam it shut, but the rust and weight of the door kept it open. It took 3 of us pulling with all our strength to close it behind us. Just before we did, we could see the silhouette of the man in the darkness watching us, his white teeth being the only feature we could see. We sat behind the metal door, catching our breath for a moment, all looking at each other for confirmation we really just saw that. After a little bit of labored breathing from each of us, we heard a light tapping on the other side of the door. That's when we decided it was time to leave. We booked it out of the complex and ran home. A year after we visited that spot, police were doing a routine search of the area and stumbled upon the man. It was stated that this guy used to go to the psych ward before it closed down. He had been transferred to another place, and when let out, he went back and lived off the wildlife around the complex for a while. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of diseases and sicknesses from eating raw meat, and his mental condition was much worse than before. There were of course rumors that he'd killed someone in the forest while searching for food and eaten them, but nothing like that had ever been confirmed. I guess the guy couldn't let go of his old habits. This story happened to me a while back when I still lived at my parents' home. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings that also lived there with me, a brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad normally left for work at 2 a.m. I had always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. On this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was home, however. In the middle of the night, I was woken up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to grab my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms, you could look down over the banister and see all the way to our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock and noticed it was around 2:30 a.m. or so. My brother told me there were 2 men at our front door. This really woke me up. We quietly walked out of my room and peeked over to look down at the area. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I did notice my parents off to the side, just out of view of the glass on the front door. I whispered down to my dad to ask what was happening. He told me there were 2 men who had been standing there talking to each other in front of our door and knocking continuously. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back to my room and grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure they weren't at the door once more. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it was in direct view. My brother was right behind me as we headed over to where my parents were, whispering to try and find out what was going on. Apparently, my parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking and come out to find these 2 strange men knocking loudly at the door over and over. At this point, the men returned and began to knock again, despite the fact that no one had come to the door and our dog was still actively barking. The fact that they were here at this time, in a location where houses were spread out over hundreds of yards and still knocking, made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes of knocking, the men walked away. We all shuffled across the kitchen into the family room to peek out the windows into our driveway. We could see there was a black Cadillac just sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see, and no one seemed to be in the immediate area either. Immediately, the question was, well, where did those guys go then? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door either. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handles on our back French door started to jiggle wildly. They were actively trying to enter the back of our home, which entered directly into the kitchen. At this point, I remember my mom frantically calling my dad's name as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then, 2 things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility I may have to shoot someone tonight. And secondly, my dad grabbed the phone, called the police, and very calmly told them what was happening. After a minute of jiggling, they stopped with the back door and disappeared once again, only to return to knocking at the front door later. At this point, several minutes had gone by. Suddenly, we saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers, all with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the two men bolted away, attempting to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of our view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer, now yelling at him to get on the ground. He didn't and tried to run still, and was immediately tased. He fell flat on his face. Some of the officers went around the house after the other man. One of them came to talk to my dad, and I came out the front as well. They actually ended up finding the other guy hiding in my sister's playhouse in the backyard. It appears both of them were drunk or high or something, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. They were both arrested that night, but we did never figure out what they were charged with, or what happened with them. We weren't sure why they were there either. Needless to say though, the whole experience was not fun. When I was around 10 or so, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit as well, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off and said she would come and pick us up in 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that's about it. We went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were quite bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this YMCA had a pretty cool pool area. We changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was completely empty, all except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam some laps, but after an hour, there wasn't much left to do yet again. There was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting either. We decided to play a bit of a game, seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we'd just stick our heads face down in the water a bit. We did this a couple of times and I ended up winning. On our very last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me I'd won. Instead, it was the lifeguard, who told me to knock it off, or she was going to have to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in there anyway, we figured we'd just get out. We'd get dressed, go back to the basketball court until our grandmother picked us up, and just wait there. We only had an hour left anyways, and the water was freezing by this point. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked us if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off. The sign said 18 years or older, so of course we were super excited she allowed us to even do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass, and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside above the door, there was a clock, probably to make sure you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door you could very clearly see it. She followed us in, went over to the thermometer encased in plastic, and unlocked it so she could crank up the heat. I figured she must have to turn it on each time or something, so I didn't really think much of it. Both my cousin and I were very short girls, so we couldn't actually see the temperature that was printed on the thermometer knob. We knew she was turning up the heat at least. She left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door as well. I thought to myself though, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided we should leave in about 10 minutes or so. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but the room only began to get more blazing. It felt nice at first because I was so cold from the pool. After about 15 minutes though, it was starting to get a bit too hot. My cousin agreed we should leave so we could get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, only to find that it would not budge at all. I thought maybe it had been jammed, so I shook it as hard as I could. It still wouldn't open. I then let my cousin try. She couldn't get it to open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes anyway, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter and hotter, and I really wanted to leave. We got up and started banging on the door for help, shaking and twisting the knob trying to get the guard's attention. As the room continued to get hotter, we began to scream at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead, ignoring us. There's no way she wouldn't have noticed or heard us banging and kicking the door and screaming. By now, we had been in there for 25 minutes, It was so hot in the sauna I could barely even breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My skin and eyes were burning. We sat back down and put our towels over our heads. They were at least still a little bit damp and made it easier to breathe. I was worried about my cousin especially. She was a couple of years younger than me, and she was really struggling. I looked at the clock and saw we had been stuck inside for 35 minutes. I got up and walked to the door again. I saw the guard still just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming we needed out right now. I banged on the door as hard as I could, but still nothing. I was starting to get dizzy. I went to sit back down, but the wooden seats were so hot that they burned my skin. The towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to cover my skin. My hair was also extremely dry. I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose and squinted my eyes so they wouldn't burn as badly. I tried my best to still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped me a bit. My cousin was laying down with the towel over her head, not moving or saying anything anymore. I nudged her to make sure she was still okay. I could tell we really needed to get out of here right now. She was extremely disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was beginning to get nauseous. There was no way the lifeguard had simply forgotten we were in there. I thought she would come back soon, but there was a little voice in my head telling me that she'd purposefully locked us in there. Finally, a man just happened to be walking past the door to the pool. I was too weak to even get up though. My whole body was on fire. I was too dizzy to stand. Luckily, the man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let into the sauna and came back with the lifeguard. I saw them walking this way and immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now for sure she had locked us in there because as she neared the door, she pulled out her keys to unlock it and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer. As the man was trying to walk in, I was desperately trying to shove our way out. As we were trying to escape, the lifeguard began to shut the door and try to push me back inside. The man was clearly confused about what was going on. "Hey, what are you doing? I think they want to get out." The lifeguard let out a huge sigh and opened the door fully. I grabbed my cousin and ran as fast as I could to the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before grandmother was supposed to pick us up. We were both so shaken by what just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner, and I told them the story of what happened. They thought I must have been exaggerating and told me they didn't believe me. I truly believed that woman was going to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt I have is what would have happened if we'd actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame, so what was her endgame? I'm 21 now, but I still think about this interaction all the time. When I'm in small spaces or I get too warm, I still have panic attacks. No one I tell ever believes this story. I mean, I get it, it's pretty absurd, I know. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask for opinions or whatnot, but what do you think this could have been? Some crazy misunderstanding? Or do you think she really wanted us to die? If so, why?